I trust her. She has a nice smile. Just a smile. All of them, they smile. They smile, but in the grave, they don't smile. They hear. Killers are being filmed.
Thank you for the invitation, which has not come yet.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How is things going in our area? How is what? Things.
I've been in Algeria one day. I can't tell you anything about here, but the only part of the Middle East that is not so bad now is the Maghreb. Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, but Syria is a disaster. Iraq's a disaster. Yemen, disaster.
But when you are over there in USA,
last powerful and Christian conferences. Welcome again. ضيوفنا الأفاضل، أصحاب السعادة، الأساتذة الكرام، طلبتنا الأعزاء، السيدات والسادة، يشرفنا أن نرحب بكم مجددا في حرم جامعتنا الموقرة. اليوم نتفضل بالاستماع إلى محاضرة مهمة للبروفيسور المقرص William Quandt. Now, let me introduce to you Mr. William Quandt, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Virginia. He served as staff member on the National Security Council during two administrations, Nixon administration and Carter's administration. He was known as America's leading expert on the peace process in the Arab-Israeli conflict. His seminal book on this subject is Peace Process, American Diplomacy, and the Arab-Israeli Conflict since the 1967. In 2012, Professor Quandt received the Thomas Jefferson Award, the highest award for scholarship and brilliance in service given by the University of Virginia. البروفيسور المدرس ويليام بي كوانت حاصل على درجة ليسانس في العلاقات الدولية من جامعة ستانفورد وشهادة الدكتوراه في العلوم السياسية من معهد MIT، وهو أحد أرقى المراكز العلمية في العالم. وقد بدأ حياته العملية باعتباره مختصا في العلوم السياسية بجامعة بنسلفانيا وكذلك في مؤسسة راند العلمية. وكان البروفيسور ويليام بي كوانت عضواً في مجلس الأمن القومي الأمريكي لعهدتين مختلفتين من عام 1972 إلى غاية 1974 وكذلك من عام 1977 إلى غاية 1979. وقد شارك في المفاوضات التي أدت إلى إبرام اتفاقية كامب ديفيد ومعاهدة السلام المصرية الإسرائيلية. كما ترأس مركز دراسات الشرق الأوسط ومجلس أمناء الجامعة الأمريكية بالقاهرة، وانتخب عام 2004 ضمن الأكاديمية الأمريكية للعلوم، وحصل على جائزة المجمع العلمي لجامعة فيرجينيا في سنة 2005 باعتباره حائز على درجة الأستاذ الكرسي في قسم العلوم السياسية بهذه الجامعة، وهو مختص في قضايا الشرق الأوسط والسياسة الأمريكية والصراع العربي الإسرائيلي. وفي عام 2012 حصل البروفيسور ويليام بي كوانت على أعلى المراتب العلمية التي تقدمها تلك الجامعة المرموقة، وهي جائزة توماس جيفرسون.
The current President of the United States, Barack Obama, came to the presidency in 2009 with a very different declared policy for the Middle East. How has it happened that so little of his original agenda, his goals, has been achieved? How do we explain that? That's what I will be discussing with you today.
يريد البروفيسور في هذه المحاضرة تقديم الموضوع على أساس التفكيك وإعادة التركيب وكأنها بازل أي حجية. فهذه هي وفق البروفيسور أسلوب ستكون من خلال تحليل سياسة الرئيس أوباما أو سياسة الولايات المتحدة في عهد الرئيس أوباما بهذا الخصوص.
So in trying to say, I'm a political scientist, that's my training. Many of you are studying political science. So one of the challenges we face as students of politics is how do you construct a satisfactory explanation for some complex question like why did Obama fail to carry out so many of his goals in the Middle East. And I think it's possible to make two kinds of mistakes in developing an explanation. One is to be too simple in your explanation, to say that everything depended on one single factor. For example, yesterday we talked about the very important role of the pro-Israeli lobby in the United States. And one possible explanation for Obama's failure is the lobby prevented him from doing what he wanted to do. I think there is some truth in that, but it's not the full explanation. So as people who are trying to explain a complex question, we want not just a single factor to explain, but we want to explore other possibilities as well.
البروفيسور هو أستاذ للعلوم السياسية وقد تعود على تدريب الطلبة في هذا المجال وذلك من خلال التحليل البنيوي. أي يفضل البروفيسور أن يقدم التحاليل من خلال جمع كافة المعطيات المرتبطة بها. ويقول البروفيسور أنه يمكن أن نخطئ في التحليل إذا اتجهنا أو استعملنا تحليلا مبسطا، بمعنى أن نركز على عنصر واحد فقط في التحليل، وهو ما لاحظناه في محاضرة البارحة، حيث اعتمدت الدكتورة على تحليل أو على جانب واحد يخص مثلا دعم المنظمات الفلسطينية للقضايا التضامن مع الفلسطينيين. فالبروفيسور يقول أنه يفضل التحليل، قد يكون ذلك نوع من تحليل صحيح، ولكن البروفيسور يفضل التحليل المتكامل. لماذا؟ لأن العملية معقدة وتتطلب هذا النمط من التحليل.
The other mistake that some analysts make is to treat every issue as so complex that you cannot understand it unless you look at 5 or 10 or 15 different influences. And of course, in the world that we live in, there are very complicated relations that help to account for certain historical developments. But as analysts, we can't point to every single factor that may be important. We have to select a few that are of most importance and that have most general relevance for our topic. So today I will try to avoid two extremes. One, to make the answer to my question too simple by telling you there's just one reason, or too complicated by telling you 20 different things that influenced Obama and his policies. Although if I were writing a novel, I might want to mention all 20, but as a political scientist, my job is to really focus on the 3 or 4 most important factors. So that's my professor speaking to the students. When you do your political analysis, try to think of the 3 or 4 reasons that are most important for explaining whatever the puzzle is that you are investigating. And then I will answer my own question in a minute.
يقول البروفيسور أن الخطأ الثاني الذي يمكن أن يقوم به المحللون في تحليلهم السياسي هو معالجة كل قضية لوحدها. وأكيد أن المجتمع الذي نعيش فيه هو مجتمع معقد ومركب. إذا أفضل اختيار مجموعة من العناصر 3 أو 4، ويجب أن تكون هذه العناصر هي العناصر الأساسية المكونة للطرح أو لتحليل المركب الذي نقوم بها. نعم، القضايا قد تحمل أكثر من محور، قد تحمل أكثر من جانب يصل إلى حتى إلى 20، ولكن كمختصين في العلوم السياسية وكباحثين في هذا المجال يجب أن نركز على 3 أو 4 نقاط أساسية التي لها علاقة مباشرة بالموضوع.
So in 2008, 2009, when Barack Obama was elected president, it was a tolerated institution of slavery. People like Barack Obama and the southern states of the United States were the property of white people. The Civil War in my country resolved that issue. It ended slavery, but racism, segregation continued. When I was young, the atmosphere began to change, and the institutions that separated blacks and whites in the United States were removed, legal barriers and social barriers. But it was still difficult to imagine that in the United States, a man of African heritage could be elected president of the United States. But he was elected, and elected by a significant majority of the voters. So it was a very historic moment, and I will tell you a few of the reasons that I think he was successful in becoming the first African-American president.
عندما انتخب الرئيس أوباما كانت تلك اللحظة مميزة في تاريخ الولايات المتحدة. المجتمع الأمريكي كما تعرفون عرف العبودية في بدايته الأولى، وكذلك التمييز العنصري. وعندما كان البروفيسور شابا أحس أو بدأ التغيير في المجتمع الأمريكي، ولكن على المستوى الاجتماعي فقط. أما من الناحية السياسية فقد كان من الصعب تصور انتخاب رئيس أمريكي من أصل إفريقي لرئاسة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. لذلك اعتبر هذا الحدث حدثا مميزا في تاريخ الولايات المتحدة، أي حدث انتخاب رئيس باراك أوباما.
One of the elements that made Obama attractive to particularly younger voters was that he represented a new generation. He was a relatively young man at the time. He was in his 40s. He did not represent the old, well-known establishment figures. So there was something new that appealed to Americans. And there was one issue that he had made central to his campaign that was important to many Americans. Obama, as a relatively inexperienced politician, had come out clearly against the policy of George W. Bush when he invaded Iraq in 2003. Obama was against the Iraq War, unlike most other American politicians. And by 2008, when Americans went to vote, public opinion had turned against the war. So Obama's ability to win the election was closely related to one of his positions on an important Middle East issue. This was a vote for many Americans, their way of saying, stop the war in Iraq. So that was an important point to remember.
وبالنسبة لقبول الشعب أو انتخاب الشعب الأمريكي للرئيس أوباما أن الرئيس أوباما جاء وهو في الأربعينيات من عمره، وهذا يعني أنه كان في سن الشباب مقارنة بالجيل السابق بمن سبقوه من الرؤساء، أي أنه يمكن أن يحدث قطيعة مع الأنظمة السياسية، مع النظام السياسي السابق، ويحدث تجديدا في هذا المجتمع. والنقطة الأساسية بالنسبة للأمريكيين أن الرئيس أوباما لم تكن له تجربة سياسية سابقة، وهذا كان شيئا مهما بالنسبة للأمريكيين، للشعب الأمريكي. لماذا؟ لأنهم كانوا في ذلك الوقت قد جربوا
many of you know, Barack Obama had some background of his own in the Muslim world. As a young man, he had lived in Indonesia. His mother had married an Indonesian Muslim. He grew up speaking Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesian, and lived in a Muslim environment. He personally was not a Muslim, although his middle name is Hussein. When he became president, he swore, "I, Barack Hussein Obama, will uphold the Constitution of the United States." So he had some sensitivity to the Muslim world and the extent to which the United States in previous years had become alienated from the Muslim world for several reasons. Iraq, Palestine. So his first point on the first day of his presidency was he said, the United States will seek a new relationship with the Muslim world, peoples of the Muslim world, based on mutual interests and mutual respect. He was trying to change the way in which the United States would be seen in its relationship to the Muslim world.
كثير منكم يعلمون أن باراك أوباما له خلفية تاريخية مع العالم الإسلامي، فأمه كانت متزوجة من رجل من أندونيسيا، وقد عاش أوباما في بداية طفولته في أندونيسيا، ولكنه غير مسلم، ولكن عاش في بيئة وفي بلد إسلامي. إذن هذا لابد أن ينعكس على طبيعته وعلى تكوين شخصية خاصة مع العالم الإسلامي. وفي بداية انتخابه استند باراك أوباما على نقطة التزام الولايات المتحدة، أو أراد أن ينتهج سياسة خاصة تقوم على التزام الولايات المتحدة مع العالم الإسلامي على أساس المصالح المتبادلة والاحترام المتبادل.
So he repeated then his intention to withdraw American military forces from Iraq in, quote, a responsible way, not necessarily immediately, but he would withdraw them. And eventually the goal was set to withdraw them by the end of the year 2011, which he did. And he also said that he would withdraw American forces from Afghanistan. So clearly he was signaling that the days when the United States would send its own military to deal with problems in the Middle East or Afghanistan was coming to an end, and that diplomacy would be given a higher priority than military intervention. This was a deliberate reaffirmation of the position he had taken as a political candidate.
وقد حرص أوباما على تحقيق ذلك الهدف، أي اتباع النهج الدبلوماسي من خلال خطة سحب قوات الولايات المتحدة بأسلوب مسؤول من العراق وأفغانستان، مع الحرص على تفضيل الدبلوماسية كنهج سياسي مفضل.
A third point, which was less explicit but you could sense, is that there was a change of emphasis when President Obama spoke about the issue of human rights and democracy. You may remember that for President George W. Bush, there was a strong emphasis on the United States who tried to promote its version of democracy in the Middle East. And the results have not been very successful. And many people were questioning in the United States whether it was possible for an outside power, as much as we may support and admire democratic political institutions, is it possible for a foreign country to force democracy on another people? And I think the Bush administration was saying we should try, because the lack of democracy is the source of many problems in the world, and And Obama's position was democracy has to grow from within. It can't be forced from outside. Where it is developing, we should encourage it, but we can't be the ones who make it happen. So there was a shift of emphasis that implied that the United States would be still supportive of democratic movements when there was a possibility, but we would not be intervening in the political affairs of other countries in the same way that the George W. Bush administration had done so. So the simple phrase was less emphasis on democratization, more on diplomacy. That was the kind of shift of emphasis that he wanted to convey.
النقطة الثالثة الأقل وضوحا ولكن يمكن إدراكها تخص قضية دعم أو ترقية الديمقراطية في الدول الأخرى. فقد كانت هذه السياسة مفروضة، أي سياسة دعم أو فرض الديمقراطية مفروضة من قبل سابقه جورج بوش، وكان يحرص على تطبيقها واعتمادها وفرضها على الدول الأخرى، في حين أن الرئيس أوباما يعتقد أنه يجب ويمكن محاولة العمل في هذا الاتجاه، ولكن دون التدخل في الشؤون الداخلية للدول، فالدول قادرة بنفسها على الاتجاه نحو الديمقراطية ولكن دون تدخل مباشر.
The next point the Bush administration had stated, President Bush famously talked about an axis of evil, that is, certain countries that were so reprehensible that the United States would never deal with them diplomatically. And he had included on the Bush administration, had included Iran, Iraq, and didn't explicitly include Syria, but more or less implied that Syria was part of this so-called axis of evil. Obama never used that phrase, and instead he said the United States will seek to deal diplomatically even with its enemies. And he specifically mentioned Iran and Syria, countries that had been more or less treated as only enemies. And he basically said we need to have a diplomatic approach even to countries with whom we have serious differences. And he mentioned specifically Iran, specifically Syria.
بالنسبة لسياسة التواصل الدبلوماسي فهي سياسة جديدة تبناها أوباما، وهي تختلف عن سياسة الرئيس السابق بوش الذي كان يعتبر مجموعة من الدول باعتبارها محور الشر، أي أنه لم يكن يتعامل معها وكان هناك إقصاء مباشر لهذه الدول، خاصة يذكر إيران وسوريا، في حين أن الرئيس أوباما لم يستعمل مطلقا، لم يستخدم هذا المصطلح أي دول محور الشر، وبقي يسعى على العلاقات الدبلوماسية والتواصل مع هذه الدول، أي التزام الولايات المتحدة دبلوماسيا مع خصومها في المنطقة خاصة سوريا والعراق. إيران. Yes.
So, and the final point, and it relates to what we were discussing yesterday, is Obama said the Israeli-Palestinian issue needed to be treated as a matter of urgency, high priority, and that to get the diplomatic process going between Israel and the Palestinians, he would try to persuade the government of Israel to stop building settlements in the occupied territories, these colonies that are still today being built in West Bank. So he put the Palestinian issue on his agenda, whereas the Bush administration had essentially said it's too difficult, it's up to the parties to do the negotiating. If they need help, they can ask us, but we're not going to push them. Obama said, no, we
قضية أي قضية السلام قضية مهمة يجب أن تتعامل معها الولايات المتحدة بشكل عاجل وهام. لماذا؟ لأنها تشكل نقطة أساسية في منطقة الشرق الأوسط. وقد وضع هذه القضية أي القضية الفلسطينية ضمن مذكرته الأساسية على اعتبار أنه يدرك أن هناك مسؤولية تجاه عملية السلام، وفي هذا يختلف عن سابقه الذي كان يرى أن هذه القضية غير يرى أنه لم يكن لم يكن مركز على هذه القضية.
So this was his original outline. More than 6 years after his original presentation of these ideas, that most of these goals have not been achieved. So my question is, what went wrong? What happened? I don't question President Obama's original determination, his sincerity, but he has failed in most of these objectives. Why? The President of the United States is a very powerful man, and yet he was unable to achieve most of his objectives. So, the remainder of my talk is going to be about why did he fail, what might still be achieved in the short time that remains, and what will the problems facing the new president in the Middle East look like, most likely.
إذن كانت الأهداف السابقة هي الأهداف العامة التي سطرها الرئيس أوباما فيما يخص قضايا الشرق الأوسط. وحسب البروفيسور فإن هذه الأهداف تمثل تغييرا إيجابيا مقبولا، وخاصة أن الرئيس الأمريكي كان يتحدث بشكل مباشر وواضح مع الرأي العام الأمريكي، وكان هناك تجاوب مع هذه القضايا. ولكن السؤال المطروح هنا، أين كان الخلل في عدم تطبيق كافة العناصر الموجودة في تلك الأجندة، حيث تم تجاهل بعض القضايا أو بعض النقاط الأساسية التي كانت محددة في الأجندة الأصلية أو تم تعديلها. والسؤال طرح لماذا أين كان الخلل؟ وخاصة نحن نعرف أن موقف الرئيس الأمريكي هو موقف قوي ومؤثر. إذن ما هي المشاكل التي واجهت الرئيس الأمريكي لتطبيق وتنفيذ تلك الأجندة؟
So I'm going to mention several big categories that limited President Obama's ability to achieve his goals. But one of the very first points that I need to remind everybody of is that just as Obama became president, the world economy was going into a deep, deep decline. This had happened very suddenly toward the end of 2008. The international financial system went into very bad development. The American banking system began to fail, and the industrial world's economy and eventually the entire world economy went into a very severe recession. And that meant that much of the political capital, political energy that President Obama had when he became president had to be devoted to dealing with the immediate economic crisis. It is always an important factor in explaining political developments. Presidents in any country have to think about the well-being of their people, which means managing the economic problems of their country. And the economic problems in 2009 looked very bad indeed.
سيستعرض البروفيسور مجموعة من الأسباب التي واجهت أوباما أثناء تنفيذ سياسته في الشرق الأوسط. وكانت البداية مع ما حدث في بداية أو بمجرد وصول الرئيس الأمريكي إلى الحكم، حيث واجه العالم قضية أو مشكلة كبيرة تمثلت في الأزمة المالية التي انعكست بشكل مباشر على الاقتصاد الأمريكي، وتتذكرون وتعرفون الانعكاسات الوخيمة التي واجهها المجتمع وخاصة الدول الاقتصادية في هذا الجانب. وتطلبت هذه الأزمة من الرئيس الأمريكي التركيز على الجانب الاقتصادي والقضايا الاقتصادية خاصة في الداخل، أي أنها قلصت من اهتمامه بالسياسة الخارجية.
The second reason that it proved to be difficult for President Obama to achieve many of his goals is that even though the American political system is built around the institution of the presidency, it also is built on the concept of a sort of separation of powers. Congress has certain powers, the judiciary has certain powers, and of course, the political system has developed in a way that many, many interest groups and lobbies and businesses and rich individuals also have a great deal of influence. So even if we change the president, the political system doesn't change so easily. And so very, very quickly, Obama began to encounter resistance from some of the more traditional political elements. The Republican Party, almost from the beginning, wanted him to fail at everything. There was almost no sense of cooperation between the two political parties. The existing lobbying groups, interest groups who do play an important role were still powerful, and on many of the issues that I mentioned, there were strong interests that did not want to see change in our policies in the Middle East, did not want to see change in our policies on Palestine, and they tried to influence public opinion, Congress, and they had some success. President Obama is a very skillful politician, but he was confronting many people who wanted him to fail and who had a lot of resources at their disposal to try to ensure his failure.
النقطة الثانية تخص طبيعة النظام الأمريكي التي تعرفون أنها مبنية على النظام الرئاسي، ولكن رغم أن النظام الرئاسي يؤكد قوة وسلطة الرئيس، ولكن تبقى هناك، وخاصة مع تطور الأنظمة السياسية اليوم، أصبحت ضرورة إقامة نوع من التوازن بين مصالح مختلف الأطراف الفاعلة في النظام مثل الكونغرس والجهات الأخرى، وخاصة وحتى إن تم تغيير الرئيس الجذري في كل النظام. وقد وجد الرئيس أوباما معارضة من الجمهوريين وغيرهم من أصحاب المصالح الذين لهم قوة ومصالح كبيرة يؤثرون من خلالها بشكل مباشر على السياسة الأمريكية، ولم يكن لدى هؤلاء استعداد لتغيير سياساتهم تجاه الشرق، سياسة الولايات المتحدة تجاه الشرق الأوسط أو غيرها. وكان على الرئيس الأمريكي مواجهة هذه الفئات التي كانت تحاول إثبات فشله وعدم قدرته على التعامل مع كافة القضايا.
The third category of developments that made it difficult for the Obama policies to be carried out is that developments in the Middle East took place that were unexpected. And this happens all the time. Whatever plan you may have for your foreign policy, the world will surprise you. Something will happen. There may be a revolution or a change of leadership or an economic crisis in Europe or something that forces you to pay attention to a different set of goals than your original set. In the Middle East, there were several things that occurred in the years after Obama became president that I think forced him to shift his attention from his original goals. Almost immediately, there there were elections in Israel that brought to power a very hard-line, right-wing Israeli government, headed by the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think this made it much more difficult for President Obama to find a way of using American influence to get the Israelis to stop building settlements and to be cooperative on the issues of peace. The previous Israeli government had been a little bit less hardline, and I think Obama was faced with a new reality in Israel, a rejectionist government that did not want to cooperate on the peace issues. A few years later, the uprisings that came to be known in some circles as the Arab Spring began. Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria, Libya, Yemen. And I think it is clear that very few people in the American government had expected this development. They were not sure how to respond to it. You could see some initial hesitation as regimes, particularly in Egypt, with whom we have a long-standing relationship, encountered massive demonstrations against President Mubarak, and there was some debate within the U.S. government. Should we stick with Mubarak? Should we support the revolutionaries? Where was Egypt heading? So there was a period of considerable uncertainty, and it showed in the policymaking. There was hesitation, then there was support for change, then there was intervention in Libya, but there wasn't intervention in Syria, there wasn't intervention by Americans in Bahrain. It was a very difficult and strange period because nobody had a clear policy. So that was surprise number two. And then third, and more recently, yes.
النقطة الثالثة التي يتحدث عنها البروفيسور تخص التطور الذي عاشته منطقة الشرق الأوسط، وهذه التطورات لم تكن حقيقة متوقعة، وهي عادة أمور تحدث في الشرق أو في هذه المنطقة رغم كل الاهتمام ورغم كل التوقعات والاهتمام بها، حيث حدثت مجموعة من الأحداث التي أثرت بشكل مباشر وعرقلت سياسة أوباما في المنطقة. فكانت البداية مع صعود المتشددين بزعامة حزب الليكود في إسرائيل وعدم قدرة الرئيس الأمريكي على إجبار الإسرائيليين على وقف بناء المستوطنات وعدم قدرته على التحرك نحو اتجاه بناء السلام وفرض حل إقامة الدولتين. هذا من جهة. من جهة أخرى سنوات قليلة بعد ذلك ظهر الربيع العربي في تونس ومصر وليبيا واليمن، وقد كان يذكر البروفيسور أن عدة أشخاص في الحكومة الأمريكية كانوا يتوقعون ذلك، ولكن لم يكونوا مدركين لكيفية التعامل مع تلك الأحداث، حيث كان هناك حوار داخل النظام في الولايات المتحدة يخص كيفية التعامل مع تلك الأحداث. مثلا هل يجب الاستمرار في دعم الرئيس المصري مبارك، ومثلا هل يجب التدخل في تونس، في ليبيا. هذه قضايا لم تكن هناك سياسة واضحة مخطط لها فيما يخص الأحداث التي عرفها الشرق الأوسط في ذلك الوقت.
Two other developments, one I think very negative for the region and for American policy, and one more promising, also changed the calculus in Washington. One was the negative one was the emergence in the past year of the phenomena of Daesh, the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. This happened shortly after American troops had been withdrawn from Iraq. And in the chaos left behind in Iraq and in Syria, very suddenly there was the emergence of a political movement that genuinely looked very dangerous for American certain part of the Middle East because of its campaign against the state systems of Iraq, Syria, and beyond. And so, quite contrary to the preferences of President Obama, he found himself being drawn back into a certain kind of military role in Iraq. Not the same military role with hundreds of thousands of American troops in the country, where we now have a few thousand, but using airstrikes and working with Iraqi forces to try to limit and eventually defeat the Daesh forces there. So that was unexpected, and Americans have reacted to it, but it was not part of anyone's original design. And then the last development, and this is perhaps, from my standpoint, the more positive one, is a change of leadership took place in Iran. And as we began to see the new rhetoric, new statements from President Rouhani and his foreign minister Zarif, the United States began to respond by saying maybe this is the moment to step forward with a diplomatic initiative toward Iran. This had always been part of the Obama agenda, and we've seen that for the past year there has been sustained and so far successful negotiations in beginning to develop a framework for dealing with the so-called nuclear issue in Iran, and to use that as a platform for beginning a slow but I think important normalization of relations with Iran over some period of time. But this is a very important and recent development, which I will talk about a bit further.
هناك حدثين هامين يعتبرهما البروفيسور احدهما سلبي والاخر ايجابي. حدث في منطقه الشرق الاوسط وانعكس بشكل مباشر على سياسه الرئيس اوباما في المنطقه. الحدث الاول وهو سلبي كان ظهور الدوله الاسلاميه في العراق وسوريا، وقد ظهر للولايات المتحدة أن هذا يمثل خطرا مباشرا للمصالح الأمريكية وخطرا مباشرا في المنطقة. ونتيجة لذلك وجد الرئيس الأمريكي نفسه مضطرا للعودة ومجبرا للعودة إلى سياسة التدخل العسكري لمواجهة هذا الخطر، ولكن ليس بنفس الطريقة التي حدثت في العراق، أي ليس بتواجد عسكري على الأرض، وإنما من خلال ضرب أهداف جوية محددة. الشيء الثاني كان التطور الآخر والذي يعتبره البروفيسور تطور إيجابي، كان تغير النظام في إيران، حيث جاءت القيادة الجديدة الإيرانية الجديدة وأبدت استعدادها للتفاوض بجدية مع الولايات المتحدة، واعتبرت الولايات المتحدة ذلك فرصة لبدء مفاوضات والاستفادة منها لتطوير علاقات طبيعية مع إيران، وهو ما تم من خلال المفاوضات المباشرة مع إيران.
So I want to now talk about the current situation, as I understand it, in Washington, the way in which the Obama administration sees the Middle East issues in this last phase of its presidency. As you all probably know, next year will be a presidential election year. President Obama cannot run for a third term. We actually have term limits in our Constitution. You once did, but I think that's in the past. But we do. And so Obama cannot run again, and he would be elected. He's lost a lot of support. So there will be, next year will be very full of craziness. People saying things they don't mean, foreign policy discourse. We have a little bit more time in this administration to see which of Obama's Middle East challenges he will choose to focus on in the remaining time he has. And I will talk about three of them briefly.
الوضع الحالي في واشنطن أن الرئيس أوباما هو في نهاية عهدته الانتخابية. كما تعرفون في الولايات المتحدة هناك عهدتين رئاسيتين ولا يمكن تجديد ذلك، وإن حدث هذا في الجزائر فهو غير ممكن الحدوث في الولايات المتحدة. إذن هذه الفترة القصيرة تمثل فترة صعبة بالنسبة للسياسة الخارجية الأمريكية، لأنه لا يوجد وقت كافي لتجسيد كافة القضايا التي كانت مطروحة. لذلك سيحاول التركيز على بعض النقاط الهامة التي يستطيع من خلالها وضع بصمات أو في الشرق الأوسط.
So the first issue that I think the Obama administration is now going to concentrate on is the possible completion of the negotiated agreement with Iran. This is the single most important development for the current administration. They have been negotiating now for most of the past year. They recently, at the beginning of April, were able to announce a partial success in the negotiations. There is now a fairly detailed outline of the nature of the agreement that will be reached, and we have about 3 or 4 more weeks to see if the details that remain to be clarified can we have a few more weeks to see if this can be completed. The opposition in the United States to the agreement is very strong. Almost the entire Republicans now control both houses in Congress, and they are strongly against the deal with Iran. But in foreign policy, there are limits to how much Congress can do to prevent the completion of a so-called executive agreement. This is not a formal treaty. It doesn't require the approval of Congress. So I think that if they can complete the negotiations, and there are just a few details that remain, Congress will express its opposition, but they will not be able to prevent it. And interestingly, American public opinion is in favor of the agreement, even though the pro-Israel lobby is very strongly against it. As many of you know, the Prime Minister of Israel was invited recently to come to the American Congress to speak against this agreement. Really quite unusual for the Republicans in Congress to invite a foreign head of state to come to speak in Congress against American foreign policy. As you know, President Obama refused to meet with Netanyahu when he was in Washington. Many Americans were offended by Netanyahu's interference in our internal affairs, and this has become a big, big issue. And interestingly, I think Obama's going to win it, even though many Americans no longer support him on this issue. I think Americans are ready for a new relationship with Iran, without illusions. Iran's a difficult country to deal with, but we have been enemies for 30 years. And I think many people feel that it's time to try a new diplomatic approach to an important country in the Middle East where we have some common interests. We have a common interest, interestingly, in Iraq. We both support the same government. We both oppose Daesh. There are other areas as well. Afghanistan, where a stable Afghan government is the goal of both countries. And there are probably other areas as well where the United States and Iran will find common interests. This is making the Israelis very nervous. It's also making the Saudis and some of the Gulf states very nervous. And I understand it, but you can't change geography. You can't change easily demography. Iran is where it is. It is a big state. It has certain resources, and it's going to play an important role in the region. The Saudis would like to have it disappear. It's not.
النقطة الأساسية التي تشهدها الساحة السياسية في الولايات المتحدة ويتم التركيز عليها الآن تخص التفاوض مع إيران. وهذه العملية قد بدأت منذ ما يقارب السنة، وتم الإعلان مؤخرا عن الوصول إلى اتفاق بين الطرفين، وإن كنا ما زلنا نحتاج إلى بعض الأسابيع، أسبوعين، 3 أسابيع أو 4 لمعرفة تفاصيل ذلك الاتفاق. ولكن في الواقع أن هذا الاتفاق يجد معارضة شديدة في الكونغرس الأمريكي، وكما تعلمون الكونغرس الأمريكي الآن أغلبيته من الجمهوريين الذين يعارضون كل أشكال الاتفاق أو صور التعاون مع إيران. ولكن هذا الاتفاق إن تم سيعبر الجمهوريين عن رفضهم له، ولكنهم لن يستطيعوا معارضته، خاصة أن هذا الاتفاق يواجه، والقضية أو النقطة الأخرى أن هذا الاتفاق يواجه معارضة شديدة من إسرائيل. لذلك استدعي رئيس وزراء إسرائيل مؤخرا للتحاور حول الموضوع، ولكن هذه الدعوة أحدثت جدلا كبيرا في الولايات المتحدة، حيث اعتبرت تدخلا من قبل إسرائيل في شؤون الولايات المتحدة، وأكيد أن كثيرين في الولايات المتحدة لا يقبلون بذلك. حيث ومن جهة أخرى يؤكد الداعمون للحوار مع إيران أن القطيعة التي استمرت أكثر من 35 سنة هي شيء غير محبذ الآن، وأن عودة العلاقات هي شيء إيجابي، وخاصة أن إيران لها وزن في المنطقة، وزن سياسي خاصة بالنسبة لسوريا والعراق، ويمكن الاستفادة من ذلك سياسيا. كذلك إيران لها وزن اقتصادي ولها قدرات اقتصادية كبيرة، ولا يمكن الاستمرار في مقاطعتها، بل من الأفضل السعي للاستفادة من ذلك الوزن السياسي لتحقيق الأهداف المرجوة. ويقول بروفيسور أن ترك الشرق الأوسط في حالة الفوضى أو فشل استراتيجية أوباما في تلك المنطقة ستترك منطقة الشرق الأوسط في حالة الفوضى. هذه هي الأفكار الأساسية. أسوأ مما كانت، نعم، ستصبح الأوضاع ستكون أسوأ مما كانت عليه.
The second issue that I think Obama cannot avoid dealing with now is this fight against Daesh, particularly in Iraq, but also in Syria. This wasn't a fight that he expected. It wasn't anywhere on his initial agenda. He wanted to get out of Iraq. He hesitated to get involved in Syria. But now we are engaged. Every day, American forces are working with Iraqi forces in particular, carrying out airstrikes against Daesh in Iraq and in Syria. And the question that I think is in my mind is, do they have a strategy? Or is this just crisis management, trying to keep things from getting worse? There have been some tactical successes in Iraq. The city of Tikrit was retaken by Iraqi forces, but it's clear that things are moving very slowly, and there is more or less cooperating with the government, with the Kurds, and indirectly with the United States. So I think that in Iraq, one can imagine that eventually the threat from Daesh will be contained and eventually defeated. Syria, unfortunately, seems like a much more complicated case, and I don't think it will be brought to a resolution in the time that remains for the Obama administration. So that is one issue that is likely to continue into the future and will unfortunately be a very big source of instability in the region.
النقطة الأخرى التي لا يمكن للرئيس أوباما التعامل معها هي مواجهة داعش. فظهور هذه داعش لم يكن متوقعا، وإدارة الرئيس الأمريكي لم تكن ترغب في التدخل بشكل جديد مجددا في المنطقة، ولكن الآن عادت القوات الأمريكية إلى المنطقة. ولكن السؤال يبقى مطروحا: هل هناك استراتيجية خاصة بتدخل الولايات المتحدة في المنطقة أم أنهم فقط يحاولون منع
political reasons? Obama was encountering a lot of domestic opposition, and he simply wanted to get himself reelected president, and so he stopped pushing hard on the Palestine issue in 2011. After the American re-election, after he was reelected in 2012, he had another chance with the new Secretary of State, Secretary Kerry, to tackle the issue one more time. The president, I think, was skeptical that he could do business with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We had bad experiences from the first administration, but he gave the Secretary of State a free hand to try for reasons that I still don't entirely understand. Secretary Kerry spent an enormous amount of time and energy traveling to Israel, talking to the Palestinians, traveling to the Middle East, to see if he could somehow break the impasse, get Israelis and Palestinians into a positive dialogue about a two-state peaceful solution. That effort also failed. And the question is now, and it failed again for partly American political reasons. Midterm elections were coming up in 2014. We have too many elections, and they wanted to stop pressuring Israel before those elections, so they simply brought the pressure campaign to an end, and it hasn't started again yet. So I think there's a question mark now as to whether the president, in his remaining year and a half of useful time, will choose to address the very serious political crisis in Palestine, humanitarian crisis, and will find any new approach that could possibly break the impasse. If we have time, we can discuss theoretical possibilities. My assumption now is that he will simply not choose to pursue a strong policy on Israel-Palestine, especially because he needs support for his policy on Iran. And I think Obama's political judgment is he can do the Iran deal and count on support from the American public, even though Israel opposes it and Israel's friends in Congress oppose it, but he can't, in addition, try to pressure Israel and count on getting support in the United States. So I'm afraid that for the moment, the Palestine issue for American diplomacy, at least, is off the agenda, and that also will be passed on to the next president. I think we will look back on this issue and regret that it wasn't resolved in an earlier period. I'm not sure when, if ever, there was a good opportunity to find a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but as an analyst, I would say it probably was in the 1990s. Since then, it has become harder and harder almost each year, to the point where, as some of you heard yesterday, it is almost impossible to imagine how you would construct a Palestinian state living side by side with an Israeli state in conditions of peace. It's so difficult to disentangle the occupied territories from Israeli control that many people have now given up on the so-called two-state solution. The problem is, of course, there is no obvious, easy alternative. And so on this issue, I'm afraid that the stalemate and the underlying problems of occupation and frustrations that brings will continue for some time. And with that, I'm going to end my comments. Once my comments have been translated, I'll be glad to welcome your questions, your comments, and we can pursue any of these issues further. Thank you.
النقطة الثالثة والأخيرة التي يود البروفيسور مناقشتها دون شك كانت نالت اهتمام البروفيسور خلال حياته العلمية السابقة، حيث وضع جهودا معتبرة بهذا الخصوص، خاصة وأكد أن الرئيس أوباما اهتم بهذه القضية من البداية، خاصة بعد إعادة انتخابه في الفترة الانتخابية الثانية وبعد تعيينه لوزير الخارجية جون كيري، حيث كان هناك تصور لإمكانية بعث القضية من جديد، وقد كلف جون كيري بالملف وأعطى له كل الصلاحيات بخصوصه. ورغم أن جون كيري بذل جهودا كبيرة في هذا المجال من خلال جولاته المكوكية في المنطقة، إلا أن ذلك باء بالفشل، خاصة وربما مرد ذلك هو أن إسرائيل الآن على أبواب انتخابات جديدة، فيصعب تصور قيام أي تقدم في هذا المجال. السؤال الآن هو: هل سيستغل الرئيس الأمريكي ما تبقى له من الوقت للبحث أو لاستغلال فرصة أخيرة لدفع سياسة قوية تجاه القضية الإسرائيلية الفلسطينية؟ يقول البروفيسور أنه يمكن للرئيس الأمريكي فيما تبقى له من الوقت أن ينجح في ملف التفاوض الإيراني مع التفاوض الإيراني النووي، ويستطيع أن يكسب دعم الشعب الأمريكي بهذا الخصوص، ولكن لا يتصور البروفيسور أن بإمكان الرئيس الأمريكي أوباما النجاح في تحقيق أي مبادرة بخصوص ملف الشرق الأوسط، خاصة وأن لاحظنا أن فرص تحقيق النجاح كانت قائمة ربما في فترة التسعينيات. إذا أشكركم البروفيسور على استماعكم.
Thank you very much, Professor William Quandt, for these powerful insights on Obama's Middle East policy and for the suggested analytical arguments that are peculiar to distinguished professors. And certainly you are one of the most prestigious scholars this faculty has ever received. And we are really honored for this, for your presence here. أشكر كذلك الأساتذة الأفاضل والطلبة الأعزاء خاصة بالتوافد، وهذا يدل على حرصهم على تواصل سلسلة المحاضرات عن لدى رئاسة الجمهورية وكذلك ضيوفنا الآخرين، وأذكر منهم أستاذ رفيحة وسعادة السفير الدكتورة، واسمحوا لي إذا نسيت آخرين، ولكن مرحبا بكم. وسنفتح المجال للنقاش، فقط أريد أن تكون المداخلات يعني ليست طويلة ولا مطولة، وكذلك يحبذ إذا كانت الأسئلة خاصة من طرف الطلبة باللغة الإنجليزية، وستكون الترجمة الفورية باللغة العربية من طرف طالب وطالب بارز جدا من سنة أولى ونحن فخورين به. إذا تفضل. ناخذ الأستاذ الفاضل أستاذ بوحوش وبعدين أستاذ بوحوش.
Thank you very much, Professor. I am pleased to listen to your lecture because one of the best we have ever heard in this faculty. And I'm also very proud of to have published the book with you, Changing the Society in North Africa. And I also would like to tell you that, I am a little bit annoyed by avoiding in your lecture to focus on the forces of changes in local societies which are incapable, which allow the radical to create anarchy in their world. The local forces in the United States, justice in the United States, is considered the most precious thing, and we care about justice in the United States and the American people. In local society, justice has lost ground, and we find it only in dictionaries. What I would like to say that there is also Mrs. Clinton and her foreign policy in the bill. Mrs. Clinton also had a little bit of complicity. She was working a little bit with radical forces and encouraged them to handicap or stop the local government. What is your explanation for the lack of homogeneity between Obama's policy and his Minister of Foreign Affairs? And thank you very much.
As a political scientist, you and we think institutions are much stronger than the leadership, the personal leadership of any country. So sometimes we exaggerate that a president of any country, including the United States of America, can impose his beliefs, his political speech on the state institutions and the state strategy. Truman was a Democrat. He had a peaceful speech, good democratic speech, but it was him who authorized the nuclear bomb in Japan. Kennedy was Che Guevara of his policy became different towards Algeria, for example. Obama was anti-U.S. military intervention, withdrew from Iraq, but supported NATO in Libya. Algeria was a victim of that directly. So it's very difficult to find contrasting policies. The second question is, as political scientists, again, we always want to analyze events, we relate to the timing. The timing of the United States having compromising approach to Iran, to Cuba, and to many other countries, I might expect even with North Korea, I think it has a certain effect of dealing with Russia. Romania or in Syria. 3, and lastly, as I understood, that Obama replaced Clinton because she would maybe have more lenient policy towards Israel than Kerry. Does that mean when she becomes the president, she will be more anti-Palestine than Israel? Thank you.
Just two more questions.
I first would like to thank you for this very important, very focused, contribution on U.S. policy on the Middle East. I also want to stress the fact that our doing this lecture, so thank you very much. One question on what has been achieved by President Obama after his very promising speech in Cairo to the Arab world. That's the only question I'd like to ask. And I know that there is many, connections between what you have said in your presentation and what President Obama has, hoped to achieve when he made this speech. I thank you, sir.
Because before I meet you today, when I was a student, I used your books, references very much, because my PhD was the American policy in the Middle East, something like that, this kind of differences between America and Europe, etc. My intervention will be very brief. That at least from what I understood, you have shown to us that America looks as America is a weak power, that it is facing many challenges, that she doesn't have the power to confront, and especially these events happening in the area. In the other side, there is an opinion, a viewpoint, which says that America is supporting these type of events, is behind in order to promote its interests, to implement its policy in the area. So there is a kind of argument about this idea. Thank you very much.
And the questioner, my colleague, said that these are the forces that really bring about change or prevent change, and that what I didn't mention was that at least one part of the American government, he mentioned Secretary of State Clinton, seemed to be encouraging some of the local forces that were destabilizing. I guess you meant the Islamist movement, right? I have some trouble with that analysis because it doesn't fit my understanding of the sequence of events. The United States had no political relationship, for example, with Rashid Ghannouchi in Tunisia, with the Muslim Brethren in Egypt until after the events of January 2011. At that point, Egypt was in flux. Our main partner in Egypt was not the Muslim Brethren, it was the military. Some people said you have to also reach out to the new forces that are going to be important in Egypt. And at that point, it is true that we began to develop for the first time some relationships with the Ikhwan. But I think it is not the case that I know many of my Egyptian friends who did not like the Ikhwan thought that we should not have had anything to do with them. Unfortunately, and I'm not a supporter of the Ikhwan, but they did win the election for parliament. And it's very difficult for the United States in the face of an election that seemed to be more or less fair to refuse to deal with the forces represented by that election. So yes, we ended up having a relationship, not a very close one, but with Morsi when he was president. Our ambassador met with him. We didn't boycott the regime. We didn't try to overthrow it. But you also notice that we're supporting the Egyptian military again. So I think it's a mistake to think we have a two-faced policy where we deal with deep state here and we deal with social forces here when we try to confront them. So maybe that's the first question.
السؤال الأول الذي طرحه البروفيسور وحوش كان يخص دور القوى المحلية في إحداث التغيير في المجتمعات، أي أن البروفيسور ويليام كوانت لم يتحدث عن دور هذه القوى مع أن نعرف أن وزيرة الخارجية الأمريكية السابقة هيلاري كلينتون كانت تدعم بشكل مباشر هذه القوى وتحاول إعطائها بعد أكبر في سياسات الدول. ولكن يجيب البروفيسور كوانت أنه لم يناقش كثيرا قضايا مرتبطة بالقوى الداخلية، رغم أن هذه القوى هي حقيقة قادرة على إحداث التغيير. ويشير إلى أن الولايات المتحدة لم تكن لها علاقات مع بعض القوى مثل راشد الغنوشي والإسلاميين والرئيس مرسي في مصر، وهذه حقيقة. ولكن الولايات المتحدة نتيجة ما حدث، نتيجة التغيرات التي حدثت في الدول العربية، بدأت في تغيير هذا العلاقة، ولكنها بقيت لا تدعم الإخوان. ولكن عندما فاز لم يكن من الممكن مقاطعته أو عدم التعامل معه. ولكن بعد ذهاب رئيس مرسي أصبحت الولايات المتحدة تدعم النظام القائم.
The second question from my colleague is about the role of institutions as opposed to individuals. It's a classical question for political scientists to struggle with because, of course, institutions matter, they're difficult to change, they create their own self-interest, their own procedures. Presidents come and go and find it difficult to change the structure of the military, the structure of the bureaucracy. All of that is true. On the other hand, you cannot reduce the game of politics only to the clash of institutions. Institutions are made up of individuals. And I still believe that you cannot take the individual actor completely out of your analysis. Even if there are just occasional moments when presidents make decisions. For example, you mentioned President Kennedy. I'm not sure that a different individual would have handled the Cuban Missile Crisis the way he did. We know now from sources what was said inside the room when decisions were being made about nuclear war. And many people in the room thought that we needed to invade Cuba. The president decided not to. So sometimes it matters who is president. I think it mattered in 2003 that George W. Bush was president and wanted to go to war with Iraq, even though there was no clear reason. The so-called weapons of mass destruction didn't exist. So I'm not sure a different person, if, say, Al Gore had become president, would have invaded Iraq. And the Middle East would look different today if that had not happened. So even if there are just occasional moments when a president can make a difference, those moments matter. And I think the Iranian case may be one now, where if Obama were not president, the weight of the institutions, the Congress, the lobbies, could be said about Nixon going to China. It was not an obvious step for an American president to take, especially Richard Nixon, anti-communist, conservative, Cold Warrior. He, of all people, ends up going to Beijing and meeting with Mao Zedong. So I think there are moments when it matters who is president, not just in our society, in other societies as well. But you're of course right that institutions matter. You mentioned one other point, the timing of certain moves in politics. You mentioned the normalization of relations with Cuba, and perhaps the step of improved relations with Iran. I think it's true that these developments are coming at a particular moment, and we have difficult relations with Russia, but it's also coming late in Obama's second term. I think that's the crucial timing. In his first term, it would have been controversial to normalize relations with Cuba. It might have cost him some political support. Now it doesn't matter. He will never run for any political office again. American public opinion is ready for normalization of relations with Cuba, and it will happen much more quickly than normalization of relations with Iran. But I think on both of these issues, he quite deliberately left the move toward relations with old enemies too late in his presidency in order to avoid the electoral implications, which is an institutional concern. But you're right, the timing is crucial. But in this case, I think he's passed his re-election, he's passed the congressional midterms, he's in a period when those electoral considerations no longer matter to him.
السؤال الثاني كان لأستاذنا الفاضل بروفيسور دبش، وسأل السياسية، وهذا دون شك يهمنا نحن كمختصين في العلوم السياسية. يقول بروفيسور أنه حقيقة لا يمكن اختزال اللعبة السياسية في المؤسسات، حيث يبقى لبعض الأفراد الذين لهم وزن خاص على مستوى السياسة ولهم دور سياسي هام، يمكن أن يكون لهم تأثير كبير في بعض القضايا السياسية. وذكر لنا أمثلة لذلك مثل دور الرئيس الأمريكي السابق كينيدي في قضية كوبا، وكذلك عام 2003 عندما قرر الرئيس الأمريكي بوش الذهاب للحرب رغم عدم وضوح سبب لذلك، الحرب ضد العراق. كذلك يسأل البروفيسور إن كان الجور نجح في هذه الانتخابات، هل كان سيحدث غزو للعراق؟ إذا هنا يود البروفيسور التأكيد على أن هناك من الأفراد الفاعلين الذين لهم دور مباشر في تحقيق السياسات الدولية. السؤال الثاني البروفيسور كان حول العلاقات تطبيع أو العلاقات الطبيعية مع كوبا وإيران. يؤكد البروفيسور مرة أخرى أنه نعم هذا توجه جديد في السياسة الأمريكية، وقد نجح أوباما رغم أنه الآن في آخر نهاية فترة الثانية من عهدته الرئاسية، ولكن يجب القول أن هذه الفترة غير كافية لتحقيق تغيير جذري ونهائي وطرح حلول نهائية لذلك، ولكن تبقى هذه المبادرات تمثل تغييرا جيدا أو تغييرا حقيقيا بالنسبة لهذه المواضيع.
I'll answer the next two questions briefly. The question was about Hillary Clinton and her attitude on Israel-Palestine issues. I think it's clear that as Secretary of State, she did not want to get involved in this issue. She is a very political actor. We will see as her campaign develops that she will be very predictably the best friend of Israel that you could possibly imagine. And she, even though Hillary Clinton, when she was First Lady, her husband was president, was one of the early Americans to say the Palestinians had the right to have a state of their own. You won't hear her making a lot of statements about the Palestinians in the coming year or so. She desperately wants to be president. She will not, I think, make surprises if she gets elected. She will not want to touch this issue. Her husband touched it and spent a lot of time on it and failed. Hillary Clinton will be very skeptical about the possibility of doing anything constructive for Israeli and Palestinian peace, I think. So don't get your hopes up for Hillary. What happened to the Cairo speech, much of what I'm discussing is the answer to that. But I think the single biggest problem for Obama, after he listed his objectives, which was largely set out in the Cairo speech, was that there was no big strategy behind the speech. The speech was a list of goals. And in politics, you need more than a list. You need a strategy to make it happen. And where he first failed, and it was a very important failure, was on Israel-Palestine. He said to the Israelis, you have to stop building settlements in the occupied territories if negotiations are going to have a chance of success. And Netanyahu said, no, I won't do it. So, what do you do next? And unfortunately, there was no answer. He was not prepared to use the power that the United States theoretically has to influence Israel. And that failure was seen by everybody. The United States set an agenda, and the first time it was tested, it failed. So everything else then became more difficult. And I think that, plus many other unexpected developments, meant that the Cairo speech, we look back on it now as a kind of artifact of history, not as a plan for the future. One more.
بالنسبة للسؤال حول دور وزيرة الخارجية الأمريكية السابقة هيلاري كلينتون، يقول بروفيسور أنها مدركة لواقع السياسة الدولية، خاصة وأنها كانت زوجة الرئيس الأمريكي السابق، وأنها كانت عميدة لولاية نيويورك، وهذه الولاية طبعا ولاية للنشاط السياسي دور كبير فيها. والشيء الهام يقول بروفيسور أن هيلاري كلينتون كانت من بين أول الأمريكيين الذين أعلنوا أنه من حق الفلسطينيين الحصول على أرض خاصة بهم، ولكن يشير أن زوجها اهتم بهذا الملف ولكنه فشل فيه، وهذا ما يفيد أنها ستتعامل مع هذا الملف بحذر، ولكن لا يجب أن نأمل في تغيير كبير بهذا الخصوص. هذا بالنسبة للسؤال الخاص بهيلاري. أما سؤال الدكتور الفاضل دار حول خطاب أوباما في جامعة القاهرة، يقول البروفيسور أن هذا الخطاب لم يكن له علاقة مباشرة باستراتيجية الولايات المتحدة التي يمكن تجسيدها على الواقع. فمثلا بالنسبة للملف الإسرائيلي العربي لم يكن من الممكن فرض أي شيء على الإسرائيليين في هذا الخصوص. إذا ينظر إلى هذا الخطاب باعتباره جزء من الماضي ولا يمكن أن نبني عليه أي شيء في المستقبل.
The last question, a very intriguing one, is the apparent duality of I described an American president who is relatively